The photo on my work badge is not sorry. That's the wrong story. Let me start again. The intake form on top of my scan pile has my name on it. Kevin M. Allery, my birthday, my mother's maiden name in the guarantor box, and it's signed by a nurse who was already dead by the time it says I walked in. I've been sitting with that piece of paper for about 3 weeks now, and I still haven't told anybody, which is either the most careful thing I've ever done or the dumbest, and I honestly can't tell you which. Okay, let me back up. So this is late October, 2023. I work at Mercy Medical up on Carew Street in Springfield. Health Information Tech 2, which is a fancy way to say I scan old paper charts into the computer system and clean up whatever mess I find while I'm doing it. Duplicate entries, misspelled last names, dates that don't match between the intake and the discharge, that kind of thing. It's boring work. It's supposed to be boring work. That's kind of the whole point of the job. Our department lives in the sub-basement, 1 floor under the morgue, which is a joke people make at orientation, and then nobody ever makes again, because it stops being funny about a week in. The room is called the cage, on account of the chain-link storage along the back wall, where we keep the boxes that haven't been digitized yet. 2 big industrial scanners run all day, and for whatever reason they hum at slightly different pitches. So if you're in there long enough, your ears kind of go. The photo on my work badge is not sorry. That's the wrong story. Let me start again. The intake form on top of my scan pile has my name on it. Kevin M. Allery, my birthday, my mother's maiden name in the guarantor box, and it's signed by a nurse who was already dead by the time it says I walked in. I've been sitting with that piece of paper for about 3 weeks now, and I still haven't told anybody, which is either the most careful thing I've ever done or the dumbest, and I honestly can't tell you which. Okay, let me back up. So this is late October, 2023. I work at Mercy Medical up on Carew Street in Springfield. Health Information Tech 2, which is a fancy way to say I scan old paper charts into the computer system and clean up whatever mess I find while I'm doing it. Duplicate entries, misspelled last names, dates that don't match between the intake and the discharge, that kind of thing. It's boring work. It's supposed to be boring work. That's kind of the whole point of the job. Our department lives in the sub-basement, 1 floor under the morgue, which is a joke people make at orientation, and then nobody ever makes again, because it stops being funny about a week in. The room is called the cage, on account of the chain-link storage along the back wall, where we keep the boxes that haven't been digitized yet. 2 big industrial scanners run all day, and for whatever reason they hum at slightly different pitches. So if you're in there long enough, your ears kind of go. I don't know how to explain this. They go a little sour. Like the room is tuned wrong. I've been at Mercy 6 years. Before that, I was at a billing office in Chicopee that got bought by a bigger billing office and then closed. I've got an associate's from HCC, which I keep telling my son I'm going to finish into a bachelor's, and every semester I don't. Miles is 15. I have him every other week. When I don't have him, I sleep on a futon in the room that's supposed to be his room, because I can't bring myself to sleep in the actual bedroom when he's not there. Don't ask me why. I know how it sounds. Anyway, the reason any of this matters is that at Mercy, in my department, I'm the guy who catches things. That's my whole thing at work. Other techs will scan a chart, hit save, move on. I'll notice that a patient's admission weight is off by a decimal, or that a signature on page 4 doesn't match the same nurse's signature on page 9, and I'll flag it, and about 80% of the time it turns out to be a real error. My director, Marcy Valencourt, she'll pull me into her office once every couple months and say, "You saved us a coding audit, Kevin. Good eye." And I'll pinch the bridge of my nose under my glasses and mumble something, and then I'll go back to the cage and feel about 7 feet tall for the rest of the afternoon. That's the setup. That's the guy telling you this story. A man who is honestly a little too proud of noticing things. So it's the last week of October. Wednesday, I think. No, Thursday, because I know I'd had my Wednesday call with Miles the night before, and he'd asked me to pick him up cough drops for band practice. I remember because I forgot the cough drops, and I felt bad about it all day. And that's the kind of thing that sticks. Marcy comes down around 9 and drops a fresh delivery on my scan cart. 4 banker's boxes, all labeled ED Overflow, 2007. She says it in her nice voice, which is the voice she uses when she's about to give somebody a project nobody wants. These have been sitting in off-site since forever, she says. Joint Commission is going to sniff around Q1. Can you eat these? I said sure. Of course I said sure. That's my whole personality at work. The 2007 boxes were rough. When paper charts sit in a climate-controlled off-site storage unit for 16 years, the carbonless copy pages get a little tacky, and they stick to each other in small stacks of 2 or 3, and you have to peel them apart by the corner without tearing the signatures. The smell is the thing that hits you first. It's like you know that faint chemical sweetness of a receipt from the 90s that got left in a glove box. That, but concentrated. That's carbonless copy paper aging in a box. It gets in your nose and stays there. I got through about a box and a half the first day. Nothing weird. Sprained ankles, chest pains ruled out. A guy who came in convinced he'd swallowed a fishbone and hadn't. A whole ED shift, basically. Boring. Good. Second day, mid-morning, I hit a stack that had been paper-clipped together, and the clip had rusted through, and the top form of the stack came up in my hand, and I looked at the name. And okay. I want to be honest with you about this next part, because it matters. I did not have a big reaction. I didn't gasp. I didn't drop it. I didn't do any of the things you'd expect. I read my own name on the patient line of an ED intake form, and my first thought was, that's a coincidence. There must be another Kevin Allery. That was my first thought. My second thought was that Allery is not that common a name. Not in Massachusetts. Not really anywhere outside of Quebec, and a few pockets down the Connecticut River. My third thought was to look at the date of birth. It was mine. Month, day, year. Right there in blue ballpoint pen in that box where you write the DOB. I sat with that for a minute. I remember I could hear one of the scanners doing that little clunk it does when a page feeds crooked, and I remember thinking I should get up and fix it, and I didn't. I just sat there, holding this piece of paper with my name on it, and my birthday on it, and a mother's maiden name in the guarantor field that was my mother's maiden name, spelled the right way, which people never spell the right way. Now here's the thing. I have never been a patient at Mercy. Not once. I've worked there 6 years, and I've walked past that ED entrance probably 1,000 times, and I've never been through it as a patient. I don't have a chart. I know I don't have a chart, because when I onboarded, one of the things HIM techs do on their first week is pull their own record from the EMR, just to see how the system looks from the patient side, and mine was empty. Clean. No encounters. So I'm holding a 2007 intake form that says I came in. I flipped it over. The chief complaint line said head injury minor S/P hockey, which okay. That actually rang a small bell. When I was 15, I did take a stick to the side of the head at a scrimmage at the Sear Arena, and my dad drove me home, and my mom made me stay awake for a couple hours. And then everybody went to bed, and that was the end of it. Nobody took me to a hospital. I'm sure of that. My dad wouldn't have. My dad was of the opinion that if you could walk to the car, you didn't need a doctor. That was a whole thing with him. Except the form said I was seen. It said I arrived at 11:47 p.m., It said I was triaged, examined, and discharged home in under an hour. I flipped to the signature block on the bottom. RN attending. Diane Petrowski, RN. Written in a big loopy hand with the tail of the Y on Diane going down under the line. Time of signature, 12:04 a.m. I did not know who Diane Petrowski was. Not yet. I want to be clear on the order these things happened in, because later I'll have people asking me, and I want to have it straight. At that moment on Thursday morning, I had a piece of paper with my name on it, a memory of a hockey injury that never went to a hospital, and a signature from a nurse I'd never heard of. That was all I had. I put the form on top of my keyboard, on the little rubber wrist rest, and I got up and I walked out of the cage, and I went upstairs to the little coffee cart in the main lobby, and I bought a coffee I did not want, and I stood there, stirring it, and looking out the sliding doors at the wet parking lot for about 4 minutes. It was raining that thin, mean November rain, where you don't need an umbrella, but you get wet anyway. There was a woman out there in scrubs on the phone, laughing about something, and I remember being annoyed at her for laughing, which is stupid. She wasn't doing anything to me. She was just having a life. I went back downstairs. I sat down. I looked at the form again, and I did what I always do, because it's the thing I'm good at. I decided to verify. The obvious first move was to pull my own record in the EMR one more time, just to confirm what I already knew, that it was empty. I clicked in, typed my last name, my first name, my DOB, hit enter. There was a record, not my active employee patient record, which is separate and clean, a different one. A closed 2007 encounter, listed under my name, my DOB, my mother's maiden name, at Mercy Medical Center. I could see the header. I could see the encounter date, October 14th, 2007. I could see that it had a status of closed records archived, but when I double-clicked to open it, the system hit me with a gray box that said, "This record is restricted. Please contact HIM supervisor for access." And under that, in smaller text, the supervisor listed was Marcy Vaillancourt, my director, the woman who'd handed me the boxes that morning. I closed out of the EMR. I closed out of everything, actually. I locked my screen. I sat there, and I pinched the bridge of my nose under my glasses hard enough that when I let go, it stayed red for probably an hour. And here's the part I've thought about a lot since. The normal, healthy, functional employee move at that exact moment would have been to walk upstairs to Marcy's office, put the intake form on her desk, and say, "Hey, this is weird. Can you take a look?" That's the move. That's what a person who doesn't have anything to prove does. I didn't do that. I told myself I wanted to be sure first. I told myself I wanted to bring her something airtight, not something half-baked. That's what I told myself. What I was actually doing, if I'm honest, is what I always do. I was going to verify it into a thing so clean that when I finally brought it up, nobody could say Kevin got excited about nothing. I wanted the catch to be real before I opened my mouth. So instead of going to Marcy, I went to Google. On my phone, not the work computer. I typed Diane Petrowski, RN Mercy, Springfield, and it came up almost immediately, second hit, an obituary from the Republican, dated October 15th, 2007. Diane Marie Petrowski, age 52, of Ludlow. Registered nurse at Mercy Medical Center for 26 years. Died suddenly on October 14th, 2007. Beloved wife of Stanley, mother of 2, grandmother of 1. In lieu of flowers, donations to the American Heart Association. October 14th, 2007. Same date as the encounter I couldn't open. Same date as the intake form under my keyboard. I read the obituary twice. Then I did the thing you're not supposed to do at work, which is I opened the EMR backup and I pulled Diane Petrowski's own employee record, which I had no reason to be in, and I looked at her termination date. It was October 14th, 2007. Time entered into the system, 10:41 p.m. An hour and 6 minutes before the form on my desk said she signed me in. I did not sleep that night. That's not a figure of speech. I mean, I lay on the futon in Miles's room in my clothes with my phone face down on my chest and watched the ceiling until the light through the blinds went from black to that dirty gray we get in November. And then I got up and made coffee and went to work. Miles wasn't with me that week, which was good, because I was not a person you'd want to be in a house with. I kept catching myself standing in the kitchen not doing anything, just standing there with the fridge open. My ex-wife would have clocked it in about 10 seconds. Miles, being 15, would have asked me if I was having a stroke and then gone back to his phone. The thing that had chewed on me all night was not the intake form. Not exactly. The intake form was a piece of paper. Paper can be wrong for 100 reasons. Somebody transposed a name. Somebody filled out a form after the fact and dated it sloppy. Somebody grabbed the wrong pre-printed sheet and wrote over it. I've seen weirder in 6 years, honestly. Not that weird, but weirder-ish. The thing that had chewed on me was the EMR entry. Because paper is paper, and paper can be a mistake, but a locked encounter in the electronic system with my name on it, restricted to my own director. That's not a slip of the pen. Somebody typed that. Somebody, at some point, sat at a computer and made that record exist and put a lock on it. That's an action. That's a decision. I got in around 7:30. 7:40 maybe. Early either way. The cage was empty except for the scanners, which somebody had left running overnight, which we're not supposed to do. I turned them off, and the room went quiet in a way it almost never goes quiet. And I could hear the fluorescent above my station ticking, and I could hear the compressor of the sample fridge in the coder's corner, where they keep their yogurts. And that was it. I sat down. I unlocked my screen. And before I did anything else, I did the smart thing, which was I made a personal decision I want you to know about, because it matters for what comes after. I decided I was going to work this off the clock, on my own time, using only records I was legitimately authorized to touch as part of the 2007 ED Overflow project. Anything I found inside those boxes was fair game. Marcy had literally handed them to me. Anything outside those boxes, I'd flag, but not chase. That was my rule. That was how I was going to keep my hands clean. I lasted about 40 minutes on that rule. Here's what happened. I pulled the second box of ED Overflow, the one I hadn't cracked yet, and I started peeling apart the paper-clipped stacks looking for anything else with Diane Petrowski's name on it, which, to be fair, was still inside my authorization. She was an ED nurse on that shift. Her signatures should be all over that box. They were. I found her handwriting on 3 other intake forms from earlier that same evening. The big loopy D, the Y with the tail going under the line. Consistent. Same pen, same slant. I laid them out on the folding table next to the scanner. 2 chest pains, 1 laceration. All timed between 7 p.m. and 9:30 p.m. All signed by Diane, and all countersigned by the ED attending, a Dr. Rusnak, whose signature looked like a cardiogram, this jagged little zigzag with no letters in it at all, which is normal for doctors. My own doctor signs like he's rating an earthquake. Then, near the bottom of the stack, I found a pronouncement note. It was on the pink carbon copy, not the white, which meant somebody had filed the wrong sheet in the wrong place, which happens. Patient name, Elena Whitcomb, age 78. Cardiac arrest, resuscitation attempted, unsuccessful. Time of death, 10:13 p.m. Pronouncing N. Diane Petrowski. Countersigned by Dr. Rusnak. 10 minutes before Diane herself was entered into the employee system as terminated. 28 minutes before her obituary said she'd died. I want to be very careful about the next part, because this is where my brain did a thing I'm not proud of. I looked at that pronouncement note, and I looked at the intake form with my name on it, and I did a small piece of math in my head, and instead of sliding both pieces of paper into a folder and walking upstairs to Marcy, I felt a kind of warmth in my chest that I recognized. It was the warmth I get right before I catch something big. It's a bad feeling to have about a dead woman. I know that. I'm telling you anyway, because I want you to know what kind of guy I was being that morning. I told myself I was verifying. That's what I told myself. I went back to the box. Around 10, one of the coders, Trish, works out of the corner where the yogurt fridge is, came in and made a joke about me looking like I'd slept in a bathtub. I laughed. It wasn't a funny joke, but I laughed the way you laugh at work, when someone is trying to be nice to you and you can't afford to be weird about it. She poured coffee from her thermos into the department pot, because yours is that gas station garbage, Kev, which is true. And then she sat down at her station and put in her earbuds and started coding, and for about 15 minutes the room felt normal. 2 people doing their jobs. That was my breathing beat, if I'm being honest. That was the only ordinary moment in the whole day. Then Trish went to lunch, and I was alone again. I pulled the sign-in sheet next. Every ED shift in 2007 had a paper patient sign-in log at the reception desk, a spiral-bound book where the triage nurse would write the arrival time, name, and chief complaint of every walk-in. Those logs got scanned into a supplementary folder in the EMR years ago as part of an earlier digitization push, but the original paper books were kept in, you guessed it, the boxes I was authorized to work through. I found the one for that night in the 3rd box, October 14th through 15th. 2007. The book was warped from something wet, and half the pages were stuck together, but the front section peeled apart okay. I scanned down the list for my name. I found it. 11:47 p.m. Allery, Kevin. Head injury, hockey. Guardian. Allery. Robert. That's my dad. Robert Allery. And the handwriting for that entry was not Diane Petrowski's handwriting. It was somebody else's. A tight, small, forward slanting print, all capitals. Whoever was at the reception desk at 11:47 p.m. had written my name in. Diane, per every other record in the building, had been dead for over an hour by then. I sat with that. I pinched my nose. Trish came back from lunch and asked if I was okay, and I said allergies, which is what everybody says, and she nodded and put her earbuds back in. Here's what I couldn't get past. If Diane was dead at 10:13 or 10:41, or whenever we're saying, and if I was signed in at 11:47 by somebody else, then the intake form with Diane's signature on it, dated 12:04 a.m., that form is a lie. That's not a filing error. That's not a transposed name. Somebody wrote Diane's name on that form knowing she was dead, and somebody put it in the box, and somebody built an EMR entry to match it, and somebody restricted the record so that the only person in the department who could open it is the woman who signs my paycheck. That's when I started feeling actually sick. Not scared. Not yet. Sick like I'd had bad shellfish. My mouth got that flat metal taste it gets, and I needed water, and I got up and went to the water fountain in the hall and drank until my teeth hurt. While I was standing there, Marcy came around the corner. I want you to understand something about Marcy Vaillancourt. She's about 60. She's been at Mercy her whole working life. Started as a ward clerk in the 70s, worked her way up. She's got that particular kind of New England woman toughness, where she'll ask about your kid by name and also fire somebody in the same afternoon and not lose sleep about either one. Everybody in the department is a little scared of her and also would take a bullet for her. That's the vibe. She saw me at the water fountain and stopped. "You look like death warmed over, Kevin. You getting sick?" I said, "Long night." Miles had a thing. She nodded. She has a son too, older than mine. So that answer buys about 90 seconds of grace with her. Then she said, "How you making out with those ED boxes?" And I don't know what my face did. I really don't. I've replayed that hallway a lot of times, and I can't tell you what my face was doing. Whatever it was doing, Marcy caught it, because her expression changed by about 1/4 of a degree, this tiny narrowing around the eyes that I've seen her do to other people and never to me. And she said, evenly, "Anything jumping out?" I said no. I said, "Just messy. Wet paper. Slow going." She held my eyes for maybe a second longer than she needed to. Then she smiled and said, "Take your time. No rush on those. Really." And she patted my arm and kept walking. That's the moment. If you're looking for the moment in this whole thing, where I should have said something and didn't, that's the one. She stood there and gave me an opening you could have driven a truck through, and I lied to her. Not a big lie. Just no, nothing. Everything's fine. And she said, "Take your time. No rush on those. Really." No rush on the boxes she'd told me the morning before that Joint Commission was gonna sniff around in Q1. I went back to the cage. I sat down. I did not open another box. I did not do any more scanning. I opened a blank Word document on my personal phone, propped it behind my monitor so nobody could see, and I started typing, in my thumbs, everything I'd found so far. Names, times, sheet colors, box numbers. I don't know why. I think I just needed to see it outside my head. I think I was starting to be afraid that if I didn't write it down, I'd talk myself out of it by Monday. At the bottom of the document, without really planning to, I typed a question. It said, "Who else did she sign in for that night after she was dead?" I looked at that sentence for a while. Then I went and got the 4th box. The 4th box was the one that had been taped shut twice. I remember that specifically because most of the ED overflow boxes had one strip of packing tape across the top, and this one had 2, running perpendicular, making a cross, which doesn't mean anything on its own. Off-site storage people retape boxes all the time when a seam splits. But I noticed it, and I noticed that I noticed it. And I sat there with my box cutter for probably a full minute before I actually cut into it. Inside was more of the same. Carbonless copies, paper-clipped stacks, a few loose pages that had migrated to the bottom over the years. The smell was worse in this one. That chemical sweetness had gone a little sour, like the paper had gotten damp at some point and dried wrong. I put on a pair of the nitrile gloves we keep in the drawer, which I don't usually bother with, and I started peeling. I found her hand 3 more times. I'm going to say that plainly because I've been trying to figure out how to say it soft, and there isn't a way. Diane Petrowski's signature, the big loopy D, the tail on the Y appeared on 3 more forms in that box, all time-stamped after 10:41 p.m. on October 14th, 2007. An intake for a woman with abdominal pain, signed at 11:22. A discharge instruction sheet for a kid with a fever, signed at 11:58. And a set of initials, DP, on a chart audit line, time-stamped 12:15 a.m. on October 15th. 4 documents. 4 times her hand showed up on paper after her hand had stopped being a hand. And mine was one of them. I want to tell you I had some big reaction. I didn't. I laid the 4 sheets out on the folding table, plus my own intake form, plus the sign-in log page, plus the pronouncement note for Elena Whitcomb, and I stood over them like I was doing a puzzle, I remember I could feel the fluorescent flickering above me, that tiny buzz you feel in your teeth more than you hear. And I remember thinking, of all things, that I'd forgotten to text Miles back about a video game he wanted for Christmas. That was the thought that landed in the middle of all this. A Nintendo Switch game. I actually got my phone out to text him, and then put it back down, because my hands were shaking a little, and I didn't want him to see a typo and ask me what was wrong. Okay. Here's where I need to jump back for a second, because I keep telling this in the order it happened, and I think there's a piece from earlier that fits better right here. The day I first pulled the intake form, that Thursday after work, I called my mother. I didn't tell her why. I just called, which she always makes a big deal out of, because I don't call enough. And after about 10 minutes of her talking about my aunt's hip, I asked her, as casual as I could make it, if she remembered me ever going to a hospital as a kid. I said I was updating a form at the doctor's office, which was a lie, but a small one. She thought about it. She's 71, and her memory is fine when it wants to be. She said, "You had the tonsils out when you were 4, at Wesson." I said no, later, like teenager. She was quiet for a second. Then she said, "Well, there was the hockey. Your father took you in." I said, "Took me in where?" "Mercy." "I think Mercy. It was a nothing visit, Kevin. They didn't even keep you. You were home by like 1 in the morning. The nurse was very nice. I remember your father said. A Polish name, I think. Petruski. Something like that." I said, "Huh?" I said, "Thanks, Ma. I said I'd call her Sunday." I hung up and I sat in my kitchen for a while without turning the light on. Because here's the thing. My mother didn't know she was telling me. My father died in 2015. Colon cancer. Fast. He never told me he took me to Mercy that night. Not once. My whole life, the story about the hockey hit was that he drove me home, and my mother kept me up for a couple hours, and that was the end of it. That was the story. My father was very proud of that story. Actually, it was one of his examples of how his generation didn't run to the ER over every little thing. He told it at cookouts. He'd lied, or he'd left it out, which for him was the same thing. He'd taken me to Mercy that night, and he'd never mentioned it. Not to me, and apparently barely to my mother. And whatever happened there had been small enough that a 15-year-old kid with a mild concussion wouldn't remember it clearly the next morning. Which meant somebody had a chart on me that I didn't know existed. And somebody, 16 years later, was still keeping it locked. Okay. Back to Friday afternoon, in the cage, with the 4 forms laid out on the folding table. I sat down at my station, and I did something I want to be honest about, because it's the thing that later got me in the room where I got in trouble. I logged into the EMR, and I pulled every single closed encounter from October 14th and October 15th, 2007, at Mercy's ED. Not just mine, all of them, which is not something an HIM Tech 2 is supposed to do on a whim. We're allowed to touch records that relate to our active project, and I could argue on paper that scanning project quality control gave me a reason to cross-check, but honestly, I was fishing. There were 41 encounters. I opened them one by one. 38 of them were normal. Open, readable, nothing weird. The other 3 were locked. Restricted, HIM supervisor only. Marcy Valencourt. 1 was mine. 1 was Elena Whitcomb, the woman who died at 10:13. And 1 was a name I didn't recognize. Marcus Beaudry, age 44. Chief complaint listed on the encounter header as laceration, hand. Time of arrival, 11:22 p.m. to 11:22 was the timestamp on one of the after-death Diane forms. I did what you do. I Googled him. It took a while because Beaudry is not a rare name in Western Mass, but I narrowed it down by age and town Chicopee, same as me, which made my stomach do a little thing. and I found him. Marcus Beaudry, obituary from 2019. Died of complications from an infection at 56. Survived by his wife and 2 kids. The obituary mentioned he'd been a maintenance foreman at Mercy Medical Center for over 30 years. He'd worked there. 30 years, the obit said. Or 30 plus, I forget which. He'd been a Mercy employee. And on the night Diane Petrowski died in the ED break room, Marcus Beaudry showed up in the ED at 11:22 p.m. with a laceration on his hand and got an intake form signed by a dead woman. I checked one thing I probably shouldn't have. Marcus Beaudry's locked encounter, the header data was visible even though the body wasn't, and one of the header fields was discharge disposition. It said AMA, against medical advice. A hospital maintenance foreman at his own workplace walks into the ED with a cut on his hand and refuses treatment and walks back out. At 11:46 p.m., 1 minute before my sign-in, I don't know why that number bothered me more than the others. It just did. A minute is a specific amount of time. A minute is somebody handing something to somebody else in a hallway. I stared at that for a long time. Because a maintenance foreman with a hand laceration showing up in the ED an hour after a nurse dies of a medical event in a staff area, that's a person who is probably in the room, or near the room, or who cleaned something. I don't know. I'm speculating. I know I'm speculating. But the shape of it was suddenly very clear, and I did not like the shape. 4 locked records. 1 dead patient. 1 me. 1 hospital maintenance guy. All from the same shift. All signed after Diane was already dead. All restricted to my director's login. I want to describe my director's office to you, because it becomes relevant in about a minute. Marcy's office is on the 2nd floor, off the main HIM corridor, and it's got a glass wall onto the hallway with the blinds usually half open. She's got a couple of framed things on the back wall, a Mercy Service Award from 2001, a photo of her grandkids at Cape Cod, and a group photo of a Mercy nursing class from what looks like the mid-'80s, all these women in the old-style caps and pinafores lined up in front of the Sisters of Providence building. I've walked past that photo probably 500 times and never actually looked at it. I walked past it that Friday afternoon on my way to the bathroom. Marcy wasn't in her office. Her light was off, and I don't know what made me stop. I want to say I saw something out of the corner of my eye, but honestly, I think I was just looking for a reason to slow down and think of. I stopped at her doorway, and I looked at the class photo. 3rd row, 2nd from the left. Younger. Thinner. Dark hair instead of gray, but the same square jaw. Marcy Vaillancourt, in a nursing cap, and 2 people down from her, on the same row, was a woman with a big open face and the kind of smile you can tell is real even in a posed photo. I couldn't read the caption from the doorway. I did not go into her office. I want to be clear about that. I did not step past the threshold. I just leaned and I squinted, and I read the names printed across the bottom of the mat. And the woman, 2 down from Marcy, in the 3rd row, was labeled D. Petrowski. They'd trained together. I went to the bathroom. I did not actually need to go. I stood at the sink and ran the water and looked at my face in the mirror, and my face looked fine, which felt insulting somehow. Like it should have looked like something. It just looked like a tired 41-year-old guy with glasses. When I got back to the cage, there was a post-it on my monitor. Yellow. Marcy's handwriting, which I know by heart because she signs off on my time cards. It said, "Come see me Monday morning first thing. Nothing bad. M." Nothing bad. She wrote nothing bad on a post-it. Who writes nothing bad? I took the post-it off my monitor. I put it in my wallet, in the little slot behind my license, which is not where a post-it belongs. I don't know why I did that. I think I wanted it somewhere that wasn't the cage. I finished the day. I scanned the boring parts of Box 4, the intake forms that didn't have my name on them or Diane's name on them, and I got maybe 40 pages in before I gave up and clocked out at 4:52 p.m. On the way out of the parking garage, the attendant, a guy named Angel who I chat with most days, said, "Have a good weekend, buddy." And I said, "You too." And I don't remember driving home. Not 1 mile of it. I remember getting in the car, and I remember pulling into my duplex, and I don't remember anything in between. I sat in my driveway with the engine off for a while. It was already dark. My neighbor across the way had put out one of those inflatable Halloween pumpkins on his lawn, and it had deflated in the rain, so it was just this sad orange puddle with a fan whirring inside it. Miles was supposed to come over Saturday morning. I was going to have him for the weekend. And sitting there in the car, I did the calculation you do when you're a parent of a teenager, which is I asked myself if this thing I was in the middle of was the kind of thing that could touch him. Could Marcy fire me? Could I lose the job? Could I lose the health insurance he's on? Could a locked record with my name on it, 16 years old, somehow rear up and make my life smaller than it already was? The answer, obviously, was yes, to all of it. If I walked into work Monday and put those 7 pieces of paper on Marcy's desk and said, "Explain this," I had no idea what happened next. None. I didn't even know who Marcy would call first. HR, legal, risk management, the CEO, the state. I didn't know if I'd have a job by lunch. I didn't know if the version of me that walked into that office would be the version that walked out. And under all of that, quieter, was a worse question. Because if Marcy had known about my chart since 2007, if she'd been the one who locked it, then every good eye Kevin she'd ever given me, every time she'd praised me for catching an error, had been happening while she was sitting on a record with my name on it that she'd never mentioned. Which meant one of 2 things. Either she'd forgotten it was there, which I did not believe, or she'd known the whole time and watched me for 6 years and decided over and over that I was the kind of employee who could be trusted to not notice. I don't know which one of those was worse. I still don't. I got out of the car. I went inside. I did not open my laptop. I did not look at my phone. I ate a bowl of cereal standing at the counter, and I went to bed at 8:30 like an old man. And I lay there until Miles rang the doorbell at 9 the next morning, and I put on the version of my face he needed to see, and we went to the mall and bought his stupid video game and had lunch at the food court, and he asked me twice if I was okay, and both times I said allergies. Monday morning, first thing, the Post-it said. I had a whole weekend to decide what kind of guy I was going to be when I walked into her office. I want to tell you I spent the weekend figuring it out. I didn't. I spent the weekend being a dad, badly, in the way you're a dad when your head is somewhere else. Miles caught it. He didn't push. He's 15, and he's already better at reading a room than I was at 30. Sunday night I dropped him back at his mother's, and he said, from the passenger seat before he got out, "You sure you're good, Dad?" And I said, "Yeah, buddy, work stuff." And he nodded like he believed me, which he didn't, and he went inside. I drove home the long way, down Memorial, past the closed-up storefronts, past the car wash where my mom does the books. I kept thinking I'd have some kind of moment in the car where the right thing to do would land in my head fully formed. That's not how it works. I know that's not how it works, but I kept waiting for it anyway. Monday morning I got in at 7:15. Marcy's light was already on, which was unusual. She's normally not in before 8:30. I hung up my coat in the cage, and I got a coffee from the pot Trish had made, which meant Trish was in early too, and I stood at my station for maybe 3 minutes without turning on my monitor. Then I picked up the folder I'd put together at home over the weekend, 7 pages, plus a printout of the EMR encounter headers I couldn't open, plus a page of my own handwritten timeline, and I walked upstairs. Marcy's door was open. She was at her desk with her reading glasses on, going through what looked like the on-call schedule. She looked up. "Kevin, come in." "Shut the door." I shut it. She took her glasses off. She folded her hands on top of the schedule. She has these hands that look like she's spent 40 years using them, which she has. And she said, very evenly, "How long have you had the intake form?" Not a question about whether I had it, a question about how long. I want to tell you I said something smart. I didn't. I sat down in the chair across from her desk and I said, "Since Thursday." She nodded, slow, like she was doing the math on what 4 days meant. Then she said, "Okay, Kevin, I need you to listen for a minute, and I need you to not talk. Can you do that?" I said, "Yeah." And then she told me, not all of it, not cleanly, but enough. What she told me, and I'm compressing this because she took maybe 20 minutes to get it out, and it wasn't in a straight line, and she stopped twice to blow her nose with a tissue from the box on her desk, was that on the night of October 14th, 2007, Diane Petrowski had a stroke in the ED staff break room at approximately 10:20 p.m. Marcy was the charge nurse on the floor that night. Marcy was the one who found her. Marcy was the one who called the code on her own colleague, her own friend from nursing school, and worked her for 18 minutes before Rusnak called it. Diane was declared at 10:41. The ED that night was, in Marcy's word, a disaster. They were short 2 nurses to start with, 1 call-out, 1 on maternity, and now they were down a 3rd. The waiting room was full. There was a cardiac arrest that had come in 20 minutes before Diane went down, an elderly woman named Elena Whitcomb, who they had also lost. 2 deaths in an hour on a short-staffed shift. Marcy said the charge nurse's job, when something like that happens, is not to grieve. The charge nurse's job is to keep the floor moving so that the next person who walks through the door doesn't die of the weight. She kept the floor moving. The way she kept the floor moving was this. There was a practice in that ED, which she said was not written down anywhere and was not, to her knowledge, unique to Mercy, called carry signing. When a nurse went down, mid-shift, retired, called out sick, walked off, died the paperwork they'd started but not finished, and sometimes the paperwork for patients they'd been about to see got signed by whoever the charge assigned, usually the charge herself. The rationale, as it was explained to her when she was 26 and green, was that a chart with a gap in the signature line triggered a quality review, and a quality review on a night with 2 deaths triggered a joint commission look, and a joint commission look on a short-staffed ED with 2 deaths could shut a service down for a week and cost people their jobs. So you signed. You dated it to when the care actually happened. You kept the paper clean. You protected the department. That's what she told me. She used the word protect. She used it 3 times. I said, and I remember this because my voice came out smaller than I wanted. I said, "You signed my form." She said, "I signed a lot of forms that night, Kevin." Then she said, "Yours was near the end. Your dad brought you in at 11:15. You had a knot on your temple the size of a peach pit, and you were making jokes about the Bruins. Rusnak looked at you, checked your pupils, told your dad to keep you up a few hours. You were out in under 40 minutes. I signed the intake with Diane's name because the shift roster said Diane was working the walk-in triage that hour, and the roster gets audited against the chart signatures. If the signatures don't match the roster, it flags. So I matched it. I said, "Why is the record locked?" She was quiet for a second. Then she said, "Because in 2011 we digitized the 2007 ED paper, and when we did, somebody in HIM, not me, This was before I ran the department flagged the discrepancy between the shift roster and Diane's declared time of death. 4 charts. Yours, Elena's, Marcus Beaudry's, and the Wong kid with the fever. Instead of unwinding it, which would have meant admitting the carry sign, they locked the 4 encounters at the supervisor level and moved on. When I got the director job in 2014, they were handed to me with the login. I've had them for 9 years, Kevin. I've never opened yours, not once. I want you to know that. I said, you knew my name was on one of them. She said, yes. I said, you gave me the boxes. And she looked at me, and her face did something I hadn't seen it do before, which was it went soft in a way that was not comforting. It was the softness of a person who has already made a decision and is now watching you catch up to it. She said, Kevin, the boxes were going to somebody. Joint Commission is going to sniff around in the first quarter. Those boxes had to be scanned. I could have given them to Trish. I could have given them to the new kid. I gave them to you because you're the one who catches things, and I would rather you find your own name in a box in my department than have somebody else find it and bring it to me not knowing what they had. Do you understand what I'm telling you? I did. I understood it exactly. She hadn't been careless. She'd been choosing me specifically, because I was the one who caught things, and she needed the catch to happen inside her department instead of outside it. She needed the person carrying the paper to be somebody she could sit across a desk from in this office on a Monday morning and tell the truth to. She'd been managing me for years, probably. Every good eye, Kevin, every compliment. She had been building the version of me who would walk into this room with a folder and hand her the folder instead of handing it to somebody else. And here's the part I have to say out loud, because it's the part that lives with me. It worked. It had already worked. I was sitting in her office. I hadn't called anyone, hadn't emailed anyone. The folder in my lap was the only folder, and I hadn't even printed a copy for myself and mailed it to my own house, which is what people do in movies, and which I had genuinely thought about doing on Sunday night and had not done. She knew it was the only folder, because if it hadn't been, I wouldn't have needed the meeting. I said, "What happens now?" She said, "That's up to you. I'll tell you what your options are, and I'll tell you what I'd like. But it's up to you. I want to be clear about that." She said my options were 3. 1, I could file a formal report with compliance. She would not stop me. She would not retaliate. But she'd almost certainly lose her job, she said, because the carry sign practice was, in current regulatory language, records fraud. And the fact that the 4 encounters had been locked instead of unwound in 2011 made it worse, not better. She said the hospital would probably survive it. She might not. She was 62. She had 18 months to Medicare. 2, I could take it to a lawyer. My chart, my name, my call. She wouldn't fight it. She'd cooperate with discovery. Same downstream, probably. 3, I could scan the box. All 4 locked encounters would get quietly unwound. As part of the routine 2007 cleanup, she'd already drafted the correction memo, she said, and she opened her drawer and showed me. And it was real. It existed. It had a date on it from 3 weeks earlier, which meant she had written it the day she gave me the boxes, and the corrected records would go into the EMR with a standard late entry annotation, and no one outside the department would ever specifically look at them again. She said the memo did not name her. It named prior HIM leadership and documentation practices no longer in effect. She said, "I'm not asking you to lie, Kevin. The correction is real. The paper will be right when it's done. I'm asking you whether you need the people who did this named or whether you need the paper right." I sat there. I want to tell you I gave her the hard answer. I want to tell you I said the people, Marcy, obviously the people, A woman died at her post, and you wrote her name on my chart. Of course, the people. I want to tell you I stood up and walked out and drove straight to the state health department. I did not do that. What I did was I looked at the folder in my lap, and I thought about Miles's insurance, and I thought about the $600 I took from a checking account in 2019 and put back before anyone noticed, which nobody in this room knew about, but which I knew about. And I thought about my father driving me to Mercy on a night he never told me about, and dying 8 years later without ever mentioning it. And I thought about the fact that if I blew this up, the person who lost the most was not Marcy Valencourt. It was Diane Petrowski's kids, because their mother's name, in whatever public version of this came out, would be the name of the nurse whose signature had been used to forge records after her death. She'd be the story. She'd be the headline. Not the practice, not the charge nurse. Her. I said, I need the paper right. Marcy nodded, just once. She didn't say thank you. I'm grateful she didn't say thank you. If she'd said thank you, I think I would have changed my mind on the spot. She said, finish the boxes by Friday. Flag the 4 encounters in your project log with the standard late entry code. I'll countersign the correction memo, and it'll go up to compliance as routine cleanup. You'll get a note in your file for excellent work on the digitization backlog. She paused. Then she said, Kevin, I'm sorry your name was in there. I want you to know I'm sorry about that specifically. I said, okay. I got up. I went back downstairs. I scanned the boxes. I finished them Wednesday, actually, not Friday. I coded the 4 locked encounters with the late entry flag. The correction memo went up. My chart got quietly re-annotated with a note that said the original 2007 intake was signed by charge nurse Valencourt on behalf of assigned RN Petrowski, deceased, per shift documentation practice in effect at the time. Clean sentence. True sentence. The kind of sentence that looks like nothing when you read it fast. I still work at Mercy. I got the note in my file. I got a $1,200 spot bonus at the end of the year for exceptional performance on the ED Overflow project. I bought Miles the Switch game and a pair of headphones, and I put the rest in the account I keep for his college that has about $6,000 in it, and probably always will. There's one thing I never brought up with her. I want to be honest about that. When I was going through box 4 that Friday, before the meeting, I laid Diane's 4 after-death signatures next to her earlier ones on the folding table. The 3 from earlier in the shift, and the 4 from after 10:41. Marcy told me she signed the after-death ones. That's what she said. Charge nurse, keeping the floor moving, matching the roster. The thing is, I looked at those signatures for a long time that afternoon. I'm not a handwriting expert. I want to be clear about that. But I sat with them for probably 20 minutes, and I could not tell them apart. Not the D, not the Y, not the pressure of the pen, not the little upstroke Diane does on the P in Petrovsky. The 4 after-death signatures look like Diane's hand. They look like her hand, the way her hand looks on the ones from 7 p.m. Marcy's handwriting, on the on-call schedule she was holding when I walked into her office Monday morning, is small and forward-slanting, and all capitals. Same as the handwriting on the sign-in log at 11:47 p.m. Same hand, 16 years apart. That part tracks. The signatures don't. I don't know what to do with that. I never asked her about it. I decided I didn't want the answer, which is a decision I made, and which I have to live with, and which is not the same as not knowing. Marcy retired in April. Full pension. Her going-away party was in the second-floor conference room, and I brought a card that everybody signed, and I signed it. It was an honor working for you, Kevin. Because it was true. That's the part I can't get around. It was true. I still work in the cage. Trish still makes fun of my coffee. The scanners still hum a half step apart. And every once in a while, when I'm digitizing a batch and I hit a form with a nurse's signature on the bottom line, I stop, and I look at it for a second longer than I need to, and I think about all the nights, in all the hospitals in this country, where somebody who could not sign a form got signed for anyway, because the alternative was worse than the lie, and the paper had to move, and the floor had to keep moving, and somebody at a desk had to make a call. I know what I know. My name was on a form signed by a dead woman. The form was not signed by her. The form was signed by the woman who found her, on a night when the floor could not stop, to protect a department and a career, and, whether she meant it that way or not, my father, who had walked his kid into an ED at 11:15 with a knot on his head, and who, I now know, sat in a waiting room for a couple of hours watching people cry, and who never told me, and who I cannot ask. That's the what. I can say the what in one sentence. The intake form was signed by the nurse who pronounced somebody else dead an hour before it says I got there, because she was already dead when I got there, and the woman who was actually signing was standing at the desk, keeping the lights on. The why I went along with it, why my father didn't tell me, why Marcy chose me specifically, whether she'd been sizing me up as her clean successor since the day she hired me, or whether she just needed a warm body in the cage that quarter, why the signatures on those 4 after-death forms look exactly like Diane's hand when Marcy says she wrote them herself, I don't know. I have theories. I don't trust any of them. I trust the paper. The paper is right now. That's what I told myself I wanted. I got what I wanted.